The day people stop seeing your worth is often the day destiny quietly begins to see it. The final words of the rejection ceremony echoed through Moonhaven Square long after the crowd had already moved on. Clara Whitmore remained standing alone beneath the towering stone arch where hopeful Omegas had gathered only an hour earlier, her fingers wrapped tightly around the worn shawl that had belonged to her late mother. Around her, laughter drifted through the crisp autumn air as newly matched couples celebrated beneath strings of silver lanterns that swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. No one looked back at the young woman who had just become the only rejected Omega of the season. Some whispered as they passed. Others simply avoided her eyes, as though disappointment might somehow be contagious. Clara lowered her gaze and quietly stepped away from the celebration before anyone could offer another look filled with pity. The narrow streets leading away from the square grew quieter with every block until the music faded into little more than a distant memory carried by the wind. The town beyond the festival was preparing for evening. Shopkeepers closed wooden shutters, horses pulled wagons toward nearby farms, and the smell of fresh bread floated from small kitchens tucked behind weathered cottages. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, every familiar sight reminded Clara that she no longer belonged anywhere. She had spent years believing kindness would matter someday, believing patience would be rewarded, believing the moon goddess never forgot those who endured with grace. Yet today the world had answered her hope with silence. She was halfway across the old stone bridge when voices interrupted the stillness ahead. "Move along," someone muttered with obvious annoyance. "He's probably just another drifter." Curious despite herself, Clara slowed her steps. Near the base of a weathered oak tree sat a man wrapped in a faded gray cloak. His boots were caked with mud, one pant leg was torn near the knee, and a rough walking stick rested beside him. He appeared exhausted, leaning heavily against the trunk while travelers gave him a wide berth. Some glanced at him, briefly before continuing on. Others frowned as though his very presence inconvenienced them. The stranger never asked anyone for help. He simply stared toward the fading sunlight with calm silver eyes that seemed strangely at odds with his worn appearance. An elderly merchant shook his head while leading a cart past him. "There's a shelter outside the east gate," he called without stopping. "Don't block the road." The stranger gave only a small nod of thanks. Clara watched several more people pass without slowing. Something inside her tightened. She knew that look. She had seen it reflected in the faces around the ceremony only hours before. It was the expression reserved for people the world had already decided were no longer worth noticing. She hesitated for only a moment before crossing the road. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you hurt?" The man lifted his head. Up close, she noticed faint lines of exhaustion beneath his eyes and traces of dried dust across his coat, yet his posture remained unexpectedly composed despite the obvious strain. "Only tired," he answered, his voice deep but gentle. "I walked farther than I should have." Clara glanced toward his leg. "Can you stand?" A faint smile touched his face. Eventually, she looked around. No one else seemed interested. The square behind them had already returned to its ordinary rhythm, as though neither of them existed. Clara reached into the small cloth bag hanging from her shoulder and removed the last apple she had carried since morning. She held it toward him. "It isn't much," she admitted, "but you look like you could use dinner." For a heartbeat, the stranger simply stared at the fruit, almost as though no one had offered him kindness in a very long time. Then he accepted it with careful hands. "Thank you," he said quietly. Most people would have kept walking. Clara offered the smallest smile. Most people did. The stranger studied her face for another silent moment before asking, "And what made you stop?" Clara looked back toward the distant festival lights glowing beyond the rooftops. "Because I know exactly what it feels like when everyone else keeps walking." The evening breeze stirred the fallen leaves around them, carrying away the last sounds of celebration while neither of them realized that this quiet meeting, hidden beneath an old oak tree on an ordinary street, would soon change the fate of an entire kingdom. Clara watched the stranger finish the apple in slow, careful bites as the evening sky faded from gold into deep shades of blue. He ate without hurry, almost as though he had spent a lifetime learning not to waste even the smallest gift. For reasons she could not explain, that simple gesture stirred something inside her heart. She had known people with full tables who never appreciated a meal, Yet this man accepted one apple with quiet gratitude that seemed completely genuine. He rose carefully with the support of his walking stick, favoring his left leg as though every step demanded more effort than he wished to reveal. "I should continue before it gets dark," he said, offering a respectful nod. Clara looked toward the eastern road. Beyond the town limits stretched several miles of forest before the nearest traveler's shelter. The temperature had already begun to fall, and a cold breeze swept across the bridge, carrying the scent of pine and approaching rain. "You will not reach the shelter before nightfall," she said softly. "Not walking like that." He glanced toward the distant tree line before answering with surprising calm. "Then I suppose I will rest wherever I find a dry place." Clara hesitated. Her cottage was small, barely large enough for one person, but it still had a roof, a fireplace, and one spare blanket folded inside an old cedar chest. Since her parents had passed away, the silence inside those walls had often felt heavier than the furniture itself. Tonight, for the first time in many months, the thought of returning alone felt even colder than the weather. "I have a small cottage outside town," she said. "It is nothing special, but you may stay for one night until you regain your strength." The stranger looked at her with obvious surprise. "You do not even know my name." "Then perhaps we should fix that." A faint smile finally reached his eyes. "My name is Elias." The answer came smoothly, without hesitation. "And I owe you more kindness than I deserve." Clara introduced herself, although she almost regretted speaking her own name aloud. It still carried the weight of the rejection ceremony that morning. Elias seemed to notice the sadness hidden behind her gentle voice, yet he asked no questions. Together they began the slow walk toward the edge of Moonhaven. Clara deliberately matched his pace, never rushing him, never pretending not to notice when he paused briefly to ease the strain on his injured leg. Along the quiet road, they passed families returning home from the festival, children carrying ribbons and flowers while parents laughed together beneath lantern light. Clara lowered her eyes whenever someone recognized her. A few whispered to one another. One woman shook her head with open pity after noticing the poorly dressed stranger walking beside her. Another man chuckled quietly before muttering, "Looks like she found someone even more unfortunate than herself." Clara kept walking without responding. Elias said nothing either, but his grip tightened almost imperceptibly around the polished wooden walking stick. After nearly half an hour, the narrow dirt path opened into a peaceful clearing where Clara's tiny cottage rested beside an old maple tree. Its white paint had faded years ago, and climbing vines wrapped gently around the porch railing. Yet warm light still glowed through the single front window. Clara unlocked the weathered door and stepped inside first. "It is small," she admitted with an embarrassed smile, "but it stays warm once the fire is going." Elias entered slowly, quietly observing every corner of the modest home. There was a bookshelf filled with worn novels, neatly folded quilts stitched by hand, dried herbs hanging near the kitchen, and a single framed sketch of Clara with her parents that rested above the fireplace. Nothing about the cottage suggested wealth or comfort, yet everything reflected care. "You have made this place beautiful," he said. Clara laughed softly. "Beautiful might be generous." "No," he replied, looking around once more. "Peaceful is beautiful." Those simple words caught her off guard because no visitor had ever described her little home that way. As she prepared a pot of vegetable soup over the fire, Elias quietly offered to split fresh kindling despite his injured leg. She protested at first, but he insisted with calm determination. Watching him work, Clara noticed something unusual. Even while carrying heavy firewood, every movement remained remarkably controlled, balanced, and precise. There was an effortless confidence beneath the appearance of exhaustion that did not quite match the story of an ordinary traveler. She dismissed the thought almost immediately. After all, appearances had already taught her enough painful lessons for one lifetime. Outside, the first drops of rain began tapping gently against the windows while the cottage filled with the comforting scent of fresh soup and burning oak. Neither of them realized that this quiet evening, shared by two strangers the world had almost forgotten, was becoming the beginning of a story neither destiny nor an entire kingdom would ever be able to erase. Morning sunlight filtered through the maple branches and painted warm patterns across the cottage floor. Clara woke earlier than usual, quietly adding fresh logs to the fireplace before preparing a simple breakfast of warm bread, honey, and herbal tea. For a brief moment, she almost forgot everything that had happened the previous day. The rejection ceremony, the whispers, the lonely walk home. All of it seemed strangely distant inside the peaceful silence of her little house. Elias was already awake when she turned around. He stood near the window, looking out across the mist-covered meadow as the first rays of sunlight touched the hills beyond Moonhaven. His walking stick rested beside him, yet despite the injury that slowed his steps, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that did not belong to someone defeated by hardship. "You should be resting," Clara said gently. He smiled without looking away from the window. Sometimes the morning reminds us that yesterday does not have to decide today. The words lingered in her thoughts long after breakfast. They sounded less like the reflections of a wandering traveler and more like wisdom carried by someone who had seen countless seasons come and go. After they finished eating, Clara stepped outside to gather fresh herbs from the small garden behind the cottage. Elias insisted on helping despite her protests. He moved carefully among the narrow rows of rosemary, lavender, and sage, identifying each plant with surprising accuracy. "You know herbs?" Clara asked. "Enough to appreciate those who grow them well," he replied. "This rosemary is healthy because you never harvest more than the plant can replace. Most people are too impatient to notice the difference." Clara paused. She had learned that lesson from her mother years earlier, yet almost no one outside experienced healers recognized it. Before she could ask another question, Elias noticed a loose section of the wooden fence leaning toward the garden. He set down the basket of herbs and examined the broken support beam. "May I borrow a hammer?" Clara blinked in surprise. "You can repair fences too?" He gave a small shrug. "I have learned many things while traveling." Within minutes, the damaged section stood straight again. Every measurement was exact. Every nail was placed with careful precision. Clara watched silently. There was nothing hurried or uncertain about his work. Even favoring one leg, he handled the simple repair with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent years solving larger problems. As the morning passed, neighbors occasionally walked along the nearby road. Some slowed after noticing the unfamiliar man working beside Clara. Their curious glances quickly became quiet conversations. By noon, the whispers had already begun spreading through the village. The rejected Omega had invited a mysterious stranger into her home. Clara pretended not to notice, but Elias observed every expression without making a single comment. Later that afternoon, rain clouds drifted across the hills, encouraging them to move indoors. Clara reached toward the highest shelf to retrieve an old cookbook, but before her fingertips could touch it, Elias stepped beside her and handed it down with effortless timing. As he did, a folded parchment tucked between the pages slipped onto the table. The corner bore an intricate wax seal unlike anything Clara had ever seen. Before she could read it, Elias calmly picked it up and folded it into his coat with practiced ease. "An old letter," he explained with a polite smile. "Nothing important anymore." Clara nodded, although curiosity quietly settled into the back of her mind. Throughout the afternoon, she noticed more small details that refused to fit together. He spoke with perfect manners no matter how ordinary the conversation became. He always stood when she entered the room, as though following formal traditions that few people still remembered. At dinner, he instinctively reached for utensils in the precise order reserved for noble banquets, then hesitated for the briefest moment before correcting himself. None of these things alone meant anything. Together, they formed a puzzle that made less sense with every passing hour. Still, Clara asked no questions. She knew too well what it felt like to have strangers judge a life they did not understand. If Elias carried burdens he was not ready to share, then he deserved the same patience she had always hoped someone would offer her. Across the room, Elias quietly watched Clara place another log onto the fire before checking the simmering soup on the stove. She expected nothing in return for her kindness. She never searched his belongings, never demanded explanations, never questioned why a weary traveler spoke like an educated statesman or repaired broken things with remarkable skill. For the first time in many years, the man the kingdom believed had disappeared found himself wondering whether the greatest disguise he had ever worn was not the torn cloak or the walking stick, but the lonely life that had kept him from meeting someone who could see the person beneath every appearance. 3 peaceful days passed, and for the first time since the rejection ceremony, Clara no longer measured each morning by what she had lost. Instead, She found herself quietly looking forward to simple conversations over breakfast, tending the little garden behind the cottage, and watching Elias slowly regain his strength. The rain had finally given way to bright autumn skies, and cool sunlight spilled across the meadow as golden leaves drifted lazily through the air. Although Elias still carried his walking stick whenever they left the house, his color had returned, and there were moments when he almost seemed to forget the limp entirely before carefully slowing himself again. Clara noticed every small detail, yet she never mentioned it. She had learned that kindness often meant respecting another person's silence as much as their words. That afternoon, she carried a basket of homemade bread and herb bundles into Moonhaven to sell at the weekly market. Elias offered to accompany her, insisting that fresh air would help him recover. As they walked through the town square together, conversations seemed to fade around them. Curious eyes followed the unfamiliar traveler beside the young woman everyone recognized as the rejected Omega. Some people whispered behind polite smiles. Others made no effort to lower their voices at all. Poor Clara, one woman sighed dramatically. She could not find a mate, so now she is taking in strangers. Another answered with a quiet laugh. Perhaps broken people naturally find each other. Clara kept her attention on the road ahead. The words stung, but they no longer pierced as deeply as they once had. She had spent years carrying the weight of other people's opinions. One more whisper would not decide who she was. Elias heard every sentence. His expression remained calm, but something behind his silver eyes grew noticeably quieter. He had faced powerful rivals, impossible negotiations, and countless difficult choices throughout his life. Yet hearing a genuinely kind woman dismissed with such casual cruelty unsettled him more than he expected. At the market, Clara quickly sold most of her herbs, but business slowed before she could sell the final basket of bread. An elderly widow approached the table, searching through a small coin purse with trembling hands. After counting twice, she looked up with embarrassment. "I am sorry," the woman whispered. "I am still short." Without hesitation, Clara placed the loaf into her hands anyway. "Please take it," she said warmly. "You can pay another time if you wish." The widow's eyes filled with grateful tears, before she quietly thanked her and continued home. Elias watched the exchange without saying a word. A few minutes later, another customer admired Clara's woven scarves, but admitted she could not afford one before winter. Clara smiled and lowered the price until it matched the woman's budget. "You worked hard making these," Elias observed after the customer left. Clara shrugged gently. "She works hard too. Winter is easier when everyone stays warm." He studied her face for several long moments. She spoke those words naturally, without expecting praise or admiration. Compassion was simply the way she lived. On the walk home, they stopped near the old general store where Clara quietly purchased herbs to help ease the soreness in Elias's leg. She counted the remaining coins in her purse before adding one final item to the counter. The silver locket that had belonged to her mother rested in her palm for only a heartbeat before she placed it beside the merchant. "I would like to sell this," she said softly. The merchant examined it carefully before offering enough money to cover the medicine. Elias immediately understood what had happened. "You should keep it," he said once they stepped outside. Clara smiled with gentle sadness. "Memories stay in the heart, not inside silver." She tucked the small package of medicine into her basket, as though nothing important had happened. Elias looked away toward the distant hills, because for the first time in many years he found himself unable to hide the quiet weight settling inside his chest. The people of Moonhaven saw only a rejected Omega helping a weary traveler. None of them realized that every act of quiet generosity was becoming another answer to a question he had secretly carried across an entire kingdom. If greatness truly revealed itself when no reward was possible, then Clara Whitmore was unlike anyone he had ever known. The following morning arrived wrapped in thick gray clouds that drifted low across the hills surrounding Moonhaven. A steady wind carried the scent of approaching rain, causing the tall grass outside Clara's cottage to sway in gentle waves. She spent the early hours kneading fresh bread while Elias quietly repaired the handle of an old wooden bucket that had loosened with age. The cottage had settled into an unexpected rhythm that felt almost natural. Neither of them spoke very much, yet silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It carried a quiet understanding that neither had experienced in a very long time. Just before noon, Clara gathered her empty baskets and prepared to walk toward a neighboring farm where she occasionally exchanged homemade bread for fresh vegetables. Elias reached for his walking stick and stood beside the door. "I will come with you," he said. Clara hesitated. "The road is longer than it looks, and your leg still needs time." He smiled gently. "Fresh air has become a habit I would rather not lose." Together they followed the narrow woodland path that curved between towering maple trees. Fallen leaves crunched softly beneath their boots while birds called from the branches overhead. The peaceful afternoon almost made Clara forget how quickly life could change. As they approached an old wooden footbridge crossing a shallow creek, several unfamiliar travelers appeared farther down the trail. They wore plain cloaks and looked like ordinary merchants resting beside two wagons. One of them stepped forward politely. "Good afternoon," the man called with an easy smile. "Would you happen to know whether this road leads back toward Moonhaven?" Clara nodded immediately. "Stay on this path for about 1 mile, then turn west at the old windmill. You will see the town before sunset." The travelers thanked her warmly, yet instead of returning to their wagons, two of them slowly moved closer as though hoping to continue the conversation. Elias quietly observed every movement without changing his calm expression. Clara noticed nothing unusual. She simply believed they were strangers asking for directions. Then the oldest traveler looked toward Elias with thoughtful curiosity. "Your friend seems injured," he remarked. "Travel can be difficult in that condition." Before Elias could answer, Clara stepped slightly closer to him without even realizing she had done so. "He is recovering," she replied kindly. "He only needs time." The traveler nodded politely, although his eyes lingered on Elias a little longer than seemed necessary. For one brief moment, the quiet forest became strangely still. Elias recognized the subtle signals immediately. The careful posture, the measured glances, the disciplined patience hidden beneath ordinary clothing. These were not merchants. They were highly trained royal scouts searching every village and road throughout the kingdom. He had expected they would eventually come this far. He simply had not expected it so soon. The lead scout met Elias's eyes for the briefest instant. Something almost invisible passed between them, a silent exchange that Clara completely missed. Without speaking, the scout gave the smallest respectful nod before turning back toward his companions. "Thank you for your kindness," he said. "We wish both of you safe travels." Within moments, the group continued down the opposite trail until they disappeared among the trees. Clara released a quiet breath. "Friendly people," she said with a smile. Elias watched the empty road for another few seconds before answering. "Yes, very observant people." They continued toward the neighboring farm, unaware that the disguised scouts had already recognized the unmistakable silver eyes of the man the entire kingdom believed had vanished. Yet none of them revealed his identity. They had seen something far more valuable than the missing king himself. They had witnessed an ordinary young woman instinctively step forward to protect a stranger without asking who he was or what he could offer her in return. As Clara chatted cheerfully about the coming harvest and whether the apples would be sweet this season, Elias found himself struggling with a feeling he had never expected. He had begun this journey believing he understood loyalty because thousands of soldiers had sworn it to him. He had believed he understood respect because nobles bowed whenever he entered a room. But walking beside Clara through the quiet forest, he realized there was something infinitely rarer than loyalty earned through power. It was kindness freely given to someone who appeared to have nothing at all, and for the first time since leaving his throne behind. The weight of returning to the life he had hidden from no longer felt nearly as simple as it once had. The quiet life surrounding Clara's cottage continued for another 2 days, but far beyond the peaceful hills of Moonhaven, an entirely different story was unfolding. Riders traveled day and night across the kingdom carrying sealed messages stamped with the royal crest. Castle gates that normally stood open from sunrise until dusk now remained heavily guarded. Council chambers stayed lit long after midnight as nobles, generals, and advisors gathered around enormous maps spread across polished oak tables. One question echoed through every hall of the royal capital. Where had the Alpha King gone? Rumors multiplied faster than anyone could silence them. Some believed he had secretly crossed the northern border to negotiate with distant allies. Others whispered that he had gone alone to investigate corruption hidden inside his own kingdom. Merchants exchanged stories at roadside inns. Travelers argued around campfires, and every version became more dramatic than the last. None of them imagined that the man they sought spent his mornings repairing garden fences, carrying firewood, and quietly sharing breakfast inside a modest cottage surrounded by wildflowers. Clara remained completely unaware of the growing unrest beyond her little corner of the world. Her days followed a peaceful rhythm that slowly healed wounds she had believed would never fade. Every morning, she baked fresh bread while Elias gathered herbs from the meadow. Every afternoon, they worked together around the cottage, speaking about ordinary things that somehow made life feel extraordinary. He listened carefully whenever she described the recipes her mother had taught her, the flowers that bloomed each spring, or the dreams she once carried before believing they no longer mattered. He never interrupted. He never dismissed her thoughts. He listened as though every word deserved to be remembered. One cool afternoon, Clara unfolded an old map across the kitchen table while planning which nearby villages might need fresh herbs before winter arrived. Elias studied the faded parchment for only a few moments before gently rotating it 90 degrees. "The bridge here collapsed 3 years ago," he said, pointing toward a narrow river crossing. "This road would add nearly 5 miles to your journey." Clara stared at him in surprise. "How do you know that?" He paused for the briefest instant before answering. "A traveler hears many things." She accepted the explanation with her usual quiet trust, although another small question settled into the growing collection already hidden inside her heart. Later that evening, they watched the sunset from the porch while warm light spilled across the rolling fields. Clara noticed how naturally Elias seemed to recognize distant landmarks, trade routes, and neighboring towns despite claiming to have wandered without purpose. He even spoke about harvest festivals held in villages hundreds of miles away, describing details that sounded as though he had attended them himself. "You must have traveled almost everywhere," Clara said with admiration. Elias smiled faintly. "Sometimes people spend years searching for places, only to discover they were actually searching for someone." Clara considered those words quietly without realizing how truthful they really were. At nearly the same moment, several miles away inside the dense forest, 4 royal scouts gathered beneath towering pine trees. They had confirmed what they scarcely dared to believe after recognizing the silver-eyed traveler on the woodland path. Their commander unfolded a small sheet of parchment before writing a single message in careful handwriting. "The king has been found. He is safe. Maintain absolute secrecy. Disturb nothing." The messenger mounted his horse and disappeared into the fading light, while the remaining scouts continued watching from a respectful distance. None of them intended to interfere. They understood their king better than anyone. If he had chosen to remain hidden beside the young woman called Clara Whitmore, there had to be a reason greater than any of them yet understood. Back at the cottage, the evening grew peaceful once again. Clara poured 2 cups of warm tea before placing one beside Elias on the porch railing. They sat together in comfortable silence as the first stars slowly appeared above the valley. She believed she was sharing another ordinary evening with a weary traveler who simply needed time to recover. Elias looked toward the quiet horizon where the lights of the distant capital shimmered almost invisibly against the night sky. Somewhere beyond those hills, an entire kingdom waited for his return. Yet for reasons he could no longer ignore, the small cottage beside him had begun to feel more honest than the magnificent palace he had called home for years. The next morning arrived with an unusual stillness that settled over the valley like a quiet warning. Even the birds that usually filled the maple trees with cheerful songs seemed strangely subdued. Clara noticed it while hanging freshly washed blankets outside the cottage. The breeze carried an unfamiliar scent, crisp and distant, as though dozens of horses had recently passed somewhere beyond the surrounding hills. She glanced toward the forest for a moment before returning to her work. Elias stepped onto the porch carrying another basket of firewood. His calm expression remained unchanged, but his silver eyes briefly searched the tree line before turning back toward Clara. He had sensed the approaching riders long before they came into view. They were still miles away, moving with disciplined precision through the forest roads. His royal guard had finally reached the outer edge of Moonhaven. He had expected this moment from the day he first crossed the old stone bridge, pretending to be nothing more than a weary traveler. What he had not expected was the quiet reluctance growing inside him. Clara finished folding the blankets and smiled. "I was thinking about visiting the creek this afternoon." The wild mint should still be growing along the water. Elias returned the smile. That sounds like a wonderful idea. They followed the familiar woodland trail after lunch, carrying 2 small baskets while sunlight filtered gently through the tall trees. The peaceful forest had become one of Clara's favorite places because it was one of the few corners of the world where nobody cared whether she had been rejected or accepted. Here she was simply herself. They had almost reached the creek when several figures appeared farther ahead among the trees. Unlike the travelers they had met days earlier, these men wore well-made riding cloaks, their horses standing quietly behind them. Their clothing appeared ordinary, but every movement revealed remarkable discipline. Clara slowed her steps instinctively. The oldest among them stepped forward and offered a respectful bow. "Forgive us," he said politely. "We are searching for someone." Clara smiled kindly. "Perhaps we can help." The man looked directly toward Elias. For one suspended heartbeat, the entire forest seemed to fall silent. Elias understood immediately. The search had reached its end. His most trusted commander held his gaze without speaking. No ordinary traveler would have recognized the nearly invisible gesture that followed, a hand resting briefly across the heart before lowering again. It was the private salute reserved only for one person in the entire kingdom. Clara noticed none of it. She only saw strangers exchanging respectful looks. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding," she began, stepping naturally a little closer to Elias. "He has been recovering from an injury. He has nowhere else to go." The commander looked at Clara with genuine admiration before lowering his eyes again. "Miss," he answered carefully, "our intentions are entirely peaceful." Elias slowly rested his walking stick against a nearby tree. For several long seconds he remained perfectly still. Then, with one quiet breath, he straightened completely. The slight bend that had accompanied every step disappeared. His shoulders settled into an effortless posture of quiet authority, and the careful hesitation that had once marked his movements simply vanished. He reached down and lifted the walking stick, turning it once before setting it gently aside. He no longer needed it. Clara stared in confusion. "Elias?" she whispered. The commander immediately removed his traveling cloak, revealing the deep midnight blue uniform hidden beneath it. One after another, the remaining riders did the same. Bright silver wolf crests caught the afternoon sunlight, as every member of the royal guard respectfully lowered to one knee. No swords were drawn. No voices were raised. The forest remained peaceful except for the soft rustling of leaves overhead. The commander bowed his head. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "the kingdom awaits your return." Clara felt the world around her grow impossibly still. Her eyes moved from the kneeling guards to the man she had welcomed into her home, shared meals with, and cared for without expecting anything in return. Every strange detail suddenly returned to her all at once. His perfect manners, his knowledge of every road, his understanding of laws, history, and distant villages, the effortless confidence hidden beneath worn clothing. None of it had belonged to an ordinary traveler. Elias met her stunned gaze with the same gentle expression she had known from the beginning. Only now there was no disguise left between them. "My real name," he said softly, "is Kieran Ashford." The breeze drifted quietly through the maple leaves as Clara realized that the broken stranger she had chosen to help had never been broken at all. He had been the Alpha King from the very first day. Clara could not find the words to answer. The quiet forest that had always felt so familiar suddenly seemed impossibly distant, as though every sound had been carried away by the wind. Her eyes remained fixed on Kieran Ashford, searching his face for the weary traveler she had welcomed into her home. He was still the same man. The kindness in his expression had not changed. The calm warmth in his voice remained exactly as she remembered, yet everything else had shifted in a single heartbeat. The walking stick rested against the maple tree, forgotten. The slight hesitation in his steps had vanished. Even the way he stood seemed different now, not proud or intimidating, but steady in a way that naturally invited trust. Clara finally found enough breath to speak. "You knew who you were every moment we were together." Kieran lowered his eyes briefly before meeting hers again. "Yes. And you never told me." "No." She looked down at her hands, remembering every meal they had shared, every conversation beside the fireplace, every quiet evening watching the sunset from the porch. None of those memories felt false. Yet she could not understand why someone as important as the Alpha King would choose to live like an ordinary stranger. The commander of the royal guard remained respectfully kneeling several steps away, giving them the privacy that the moment deserved. None of the guards interrupted. They understood this conversation belonged to only two people. Kieran took one careful step closer. "I owe you the truth," he said gently. "Several months ago, I began to question whether anyone still saw me as a man instead of a crown. Every conversation became a negotiation. Every smile carried expectations. Every promise seemed connected to power. I wanted to know whether genuine kindness still existed when there was nothing to gain from offering it." Clara listened silently. "So you disappeared," she whispered. He nodded. "I left behind everything that announced who I was. I wore old clothes, traveled alone, and accepted whatever the road offered. Many people turned away without a second glance. Some offered polite words before continuing on. Then, on the hardest day of your life, after the entire town had rejected you, you were the only person who stopped walking." Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes, although she made no effort to hide them. "I only gave you an apple." Kieran smiled softly. "You gave me something far greater than food. You gave me dignity when you believed I had none." The simple words settled quietly between them. Clara suddenly remembered selling her mother's silver locket for medicine, repairing the cottage together, sharing stories over warm tea, and defending him before complete strangers without ever asking what he could offer in return. She had never imagined those ordinary choices carried such extraordinary meaning. One of the younger guards looked toward his commander with visible emotion before quickly lowering his gaze again. They had all heard stories about the mysterious woman who had sheltered the missing king, but witnessing her sincerity with their own eyes was something entirely different. Kieran reached inside his coat and carefully unfolded the parchment Clara had once seen hidden between the pages of her cookbook. This time he handed it to her without hesitation. The royal seal shone clearly in the afternoon light. "I carried this the entire time," he said. "One message was enough to bring every guard in the kingdom to my side. I never sent it because I was not ready to leave." Clara looked at the letter before lifting her eyes toward him again. "Why now?" Kieran glanced briefly toward the waiting riders and then back to her. "Because they have already found me. If I remain hidden any longer, the uncertainty will spread across the kingdom. My people deserve to know their king is safe." The honesty in his voice left no room for doubt. He had never hidden from responsibility. He had only searched for truth. Clara slowly nodded, although sadness quietly settled inside her heart. She already understood what his return meant. The peaceful mornings, the shared laughter, the simple life they had built together inside the little cottage were coming to an end. Kieran seemed to recognize the thought before she spoke it aloud. "Nothing that happened between us was a performance," he said with quiet certainty. "Every conversation was real. Every smile was real. Every moment I spent beside you was the most honest part of my life." As the afternoon sun filtered through the tall maple branches, Clara realized the greatest surprise was not that the stranger had been a king. It was discovering that beneath the royal title and hidden identity, he had truly become the friend she believed she had known from the very beginning. The journey back to the royal capital began the following morning beneath clear autumn skies. Clara rode quietly beside Kieran and the royal guard, leaving behind the little cottage that had unexpectedly become the place where two lonely lives had crossed. She looked back only once. The white fence, the maple tree, and the small porch where they had shared countless simple conversations slowly disappeared beyond the hills. She wondered whether those peaceful days had truly happened or whether they would someday feel like nothing more than a beautiful dream. As the royal procession entered the capital, church bells echoed across the city and thousands of citizens gathered along the streets. Relief spread through every face as word traveled from one corner of the kingdom to another. Their Alpha King had returned safely. Banners rose above the rooftops, children waved flowers, and grateful voices filled the air. Yet Kieran noticed something far more important than the celebration surrounding him. Clara seemed overwhelmed by the grandeur of the palace, uncertain where she belonged among polished marble floors, towering columns, and elegant halls. She instinctively slowed her steps, believing someone would surely guide her elsewhere while the king resumed his rightful place. Instead, Kieran stopped walking as well. Every noble, advisor, and commander waiting inside the grand entrance immediately fell silent. Before the entire royal court, Kieran turned toward Clara and offered her his hand with the same gentle smile he had worn the day she offered him a single apple beneath the old oak tree. "Walk beside me," he said softly. "You have never walked behind me, and you never will." A quiet murmur spread through the assembled crowd as Clara accepted his hand. Together they entered the great throne hall where the kingdom's highest officials stood waiting. Many had prepared speeches celebrating the king's safe return, but Kieran raised one hand, asking only for a moment of silence. His voice carried calmly through the magnificent chamber. "Many of you searched for your king. Many feared for my safety. You believed I disappeared because I wished to escape my duties. The truth is very different. I left because I wanted to discover whether kindness still existed when there was no title to impress, no crown to admire, and no reward to expect." His eyes found Clara once more. "I found my answer in the home of a young woman who had every reason to lose faith in the world, yet chose compassion anyway." Every gaze turned toward Clara. She lowered her eyes, uncomfortable with so much attention. Kieran gently continued. "She offered shelter to a stranger. She shared her food when she had very little herself. She sold something precious to buy medicine for a man she believed could never repay her. She defended someone the world ignored because she believed every person deserved dignity." The enormous hall remained completely still. Several members of the royal council quietly bowed their heads as they realized why their king had returned with such certainty in his heart. Kieran stepped forward until he stood beside the throne but did not sit upon it. Instead, he looked toward Clara once again. "Power can command respect," he said, "but only character earns trust. I do not honor Clara Whitmore because she cared for a king. I honor her because she cared for a stranger." Tears filled Clara's eyes as every knight in the great hall placed a hand over his heart in silent respect. The gesture spread from the royal guard to the advisors, then to the nobles, until the entire chamber stood united in honoring the woman they had never known. In that moment, Clara understood something she had never believed possible. Her worth had never depended upon being chosen during a ceremony. It had always lived inside the quiet choices she made when nobody was watching. Several weeks later, the little cottage beneath the maple tree remained exactly as Clara had left it. Kieran insisted it be carefully preserved, not as a monument to a king, but as a reminder of where he had rediscovered the meaning of humility, friendship, and genuine compassion. Whenever royal responsibilities allowed, they returned together to walk the same woodland paths, share tea on the familiar porch, and remember the ordinary days that had changed both of their lives forever. Across the kingdom, people often repeated the story of the Alpha King who disappeared in search of truth, but those who understood it best always remembered a different lesson. Crowns may reveal authority, titles may reveal position, and wealth may reveal success, but only kindness reveals the true measure of a heart. And sometimes destiny does not arrive with trumpets or golden banners. Sometimes it quietly waits beneath an old oak tree, disguised as a stranger, until one compassionate soul chooses to stop
You look
walking.
hungry. Please take this.
You are too kind, my lady.
It's all I have, but I want you to have it.
I will never forget this.